The Prioress's tale is one of the shorter but more troubling ones, and that's sort of appropriate. Her her first mention in the prologue, comes fairly high up, right after you get through the knight and the squire and the squire's yeoman. She is the next one mentioned, so that implies a certain respect for her rank as the leader of the religious contingent, the nuns, primarily, but she has other priests and such in her retinue. The focus in the prologue is on initially her love of food. She is very careful about letting crumbs fall, so she does not waste anything. You get the sense that she likes a good meal, which is both charming and a little bit out of character for what one might expect from a nun. Like a monk, is supposed to be somewhat abstemious, supposed to be somewhat self-denying, to not enjoy or to deliberately reject, in fact, pleasures of this earth. Stuff like eating, drinking, fine clothing, and luxury in any form. Certainly, of course, sex, but there's not a lot of that concern with her. The clothing comes in as at the beginning. Her little section of the prologue deals with her eating habits, which seem oddly almost luxurious, but then or self-indulgent, let's say. And then towards the end, you start to get, as Chaucer always tosses in, a reference to her clothing, what she's wearing. And what she's wearing seems a little dainty, seems a little curious. She is, she's dressed in beads, a coral trinket on her arm. She's got jewelry. And there is a brooch that she wears, a particular trinket that is engraved with Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all, which is a curious motto for a nun. It seems oddly romantic, oddly sentimental, not beholden to a vision of all-encompassing grace that a nun is supposed to have, one would think. But again, Chaucer is all about taking the surface and just plumbing a little underneath and giving a sense of what's really going on, what is the truth beyond the visible. And we start to get that in a much fuller way once she is given an opportunity to tell her tale. She comes, again, the order is always a little bit suspect, but connective tissue suggests she comes right after the shipman, who is a very, coarse and common type, and they're going to turn to her for something quite elevated and spiritually enlightening. And she, being very, very dainty in her own way and very submissive, just says, "Gladly," answered the prioress, "I will try. I will try." Humble, submissive, none. That makes sense. And then she goes into her story. The prologue is fairly simple, but the story is really where it's all at, because she, after a sweeping prologue where not too sweeping, it's again fairly modest and short, where she is thanking God and hailing divinity and the queen and all this stuff, she settles into a story that is very unlike many of the others. Now, first of all, the most dramatic thing about it is in a very different form. It's in a very distinct rhyme scheme. You get these 7-line stanzas that are somewhat elaborate in the rhyme scheme and in its artificiality. You get a sense of it being somewhat fairy tale-like, almost sing-songy. And this feeds into the narrative itself, because it starts off as a story of this little Christian boy, this little 7-year-old boy in a village who loves to sing in praise of the Virgin Mary, and he is known for this, and everybody loves him for it. He's this idyllic little boy, and he has a voice like an angel. And every day he walks through his village to the church so that he can go and sing in the choir. On the way there, he is passing nearby or through what is, in fact, a ghetto for Jews, a Jewish ghetto. And here we get to the knot of the problem, because pretty soon the devil appears, speaks to the Jews, and says that, aren't you offended that this little boy is singing in praise of the Virgin Mary, in whom, who is an affront to your religion? And the Jews are outraged. The next time they see him walking by, they take the little boy, they kill him, and they throw him into a sewer. So what we have here is a blood libel story. It is a story that bubbles up in the folk traditions, where anti-Semitism was just the way things were for many, many cultures in Europe. And it's particularly curious because at the time that Chaucer was writing, there officially were no Jews in England. Anyway, and England tossed them out in 1290, roughly 100 years before Chaucer sat down to start writing this. And so his audience probably had no experience of ever interacting with a Jew. Chaucer, it's entirely possible he would have, given his travels throughout continental Europe. It's entirely possible. It's not documented in any way, but it's plausible. Whether or not he did is almost irrelevant, though. He's trafficking in a very old and folk hatred. And it is uncomfortable to read these days. It is, they are this mindless mob. The Jews are this mindless mob who get stirred up out of outrage to assault the most innocent victim that a storyteller could conjure, a 7-year-old child who sings like an angel. Now, in the story, they throw the kid in the sewer, and his mother goes looking for him, and it's sad. She finds the body, and the corpse of this little boy is still singing. Or is singing. It begins to sing. There's a little thing about a grain on his tongue, and for as long as it is there, the body will continue to sing because his voice is so pleasing to God. And at one point, a priest, an abbot, I believe, comes by and gets the story out of the boy about how much he likes to sing and whatever, and about the grain. And they remove the grain, and suddenly he dies. And in the meantime, they have gone and rounded up the Jews and killed them all. It is an uncomfortable story. But here you get to some of the knot of reading, of reading in general, and specifically of reading anything that is separated from you by time and culture and just unfamiliarity. And there is every suggestion that Chaucer's just playing to his audience, and these stories are out there, and why not reach in there and stir them up? And hey, I got a lot of stories to generate for these people. I got to come up with some good ones. So he did this, and in which case he can be blamed for perhaps being anti-Semitic in a really ugly way. But there is also another side to this, because you can also take the perspective that, well, he is sort of setting up the prioress herself. The way this story seems to function is the prioress, who's always so dainty and polite and is being asked to give us something that makes us feel better. Give us something that is, enlightening, that is spiritually fulfilling. And she goes to this very dark story. This polite little lady, not that little necessarily, but this polite, pious, idyllic lady goes somewhere really dark. And she's not so polite anymore. Her form in the seven line stanzas is very upper crusty, very polite, very formal, very old timey and sing songy. It's like she's telling a little nursery rhyme, and you expect things to comport with that. But when you get to the ugliness factor, it turns sour. It curdles right in front of you. The murder of the Jews is in fact rather horrifying. Let me think. On like line 628, with torment and with shameful death for each one, the magistrate had the Jews put to death. Who knew of this murder, and that immediately he would not tolerate any such cursedness. Evil. This is a quotation, evil shall have what evil will deserve, end quote. Therefore, with wild horses, he had them torn apart, and after that, hang them by the law. Now, that is grisly. What is that doing in a nursery rhyme format? What is that doing in this polite lady's head? Specifically, why is she reporting that? Why is her character dwelling on that and ending that stanza with that image of not only being killed, they were all killed, rounded up and killed. Okay, that's fine. That's justice of a sort, I guess. But dwelling on the fact that they were torn apart by wild horses. They had their arms and legs tied to ropes. Legs tied to one horse, arms tied to the other horse. Hee-haw! Horses start to run apart. You can imagine what happens then and how horrifying that must be. And then on top of that, they hung them afterwards, when presumably they're either in excruciating pain and close to death, or they're in multiple pieces and already dead. So the fact that she's dwelling on that she's really drilling down and saying, this is what happened. It's ugly, and it shows a side of her that is not this polite little nun, not this, pious old woman. It is an undercurrent of horror that she would dwell on this, and the form of it just ironizes it all the more. It makes it seem all the more bizarre, so it stands out. So maybe Chaucer was, in fact, trying to suggest that this is uncomfortable. This is an ugly side of humanity. Why can't we all just get along? Now, as modern readers and somebody who, as people who perhaps enjoy Chaucer and like him, he's a lot of fun in a lot of regards. We want to believe that. We want to believe that he would be on our side with this. He would be uncomfortable with this. He is doing this deliberately to suggest that this is not okay. That's wishful thinking. We have no evidence. We can't really go down that road with him. You want Chaucer to be your buddy, but we just don't know. Now, on the one hand, it doesn't really matter. The story is what the story is, and the tales themselves need to be taken in context, and having them in taking them one at a time or in sharp excerpted form is sort of unfair, because you really need to see how one interacts with the other. This one is coming after the midshipman, where you get one kind of a story, and then her story is supposed to be seen in that context, that immediate wake. But the problem is unresolvable. You want it to be happy. You want it to be nice. The reality is unknowable. So all we have, put Chaucer aside. Maybe he's, just that crazy uncle who's always going to be talking about stuff you don't want to hear about. Put all that aside and just deal with the story itself. The story itself on the page traffics in this horrible stereotype, this horrible anti-Semitism. It raises it name checks specifically the case of a young boy who was murdered in the early 1250s, mid 1250s, like 140 years before he was writing this, and that led to that was like a generation or two before the ultimate expulsion of the Jews in England. The little boy was murdered, and Jews were blamed, and bada bing, bada bing, bada boom. 40 years later, or not quite, every Jew in England were kicked out, and they were not officially let back in until the mid 1600s. So it had some consequences. This story can give us a little insight into that history, can give us a little perspective on it. Maybe it's nice to think that Chaucer interacted with some Jews. We just don't know when he was in Europe, and thus came back with a little bit more of a enlightened view. Or perhaps he saw some and came back and said, we haven't had any Jews around here for a long time, and it's a good thing, because you wouldn't believe what they're like. There's just no way of knowing any of that stuff. What we have is a story that gives us a great sense of the character and gives us a great sense of the context, and that's all it can be. And for what it's worth, it's not bad.